Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. Thank you for joining me for Community Questions, a Q&A. Asynchronous, of course, because I've asked and you have very generously provided me with some questions on the Community tab, and now I shall answer those questions to the best of my ability. Thank you if you've already chosen to subscribe. If you haven't yet, I hope you'll do so now. Let's begin. How can I practice on the break on the low side of my range? I'm a baritone and I appreciate the practices and warm-ups on your channel, but not all baritones want to sing like tenors. Some might like to sing along with the bass guys. I'm struggling to maintain my lowest notes, D2, E2, with a reasonable tone and clarity. Great question, and quite frankly, something that I overlook far too frequently on the channel and in the warm-ups that I do, which is to say low-range practices, exercises, and warm-ups in general. Not everybody wants to focus all the time on the secondo passagio. And to answer your question, to begin with, if you're finding that the phonation is, you say you're struggling to maintain your lowest notes, so that makes me question whether you mean sustain-wise, like in terms of sustaining a pitch, or if the response of your voice at those frequencies is intermittent. In either case, as you're beginning your practice, there are two things that I would suggest you implement. One is to approach it from a lighter, brighter standpoint. In other words, try to think about the tone as being as opposed to one where you're like trying to press into it. If you find yourself doing that, what you are most likely doing is using a lot of muscle engagement around the larynx to press the larynx down. And while that may get you a little bit of that deeper coloration initially, the muscle tension won't really allow your voice to resonate to its full potential. And so you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul in a way. You're going to get a little bit of that low frequency hit, but you're not getting it in a way that's going to allow you to sustain the pitches very effectively long term. Now, getting back to that sustain versus intermittency issue, if you're talking about sustain, then in addition to approaching those frequencies with a lighter, brighter kind of application, consider your arpeggio practice and how you are maintaining your engagement. Yes, as we descend, there is a natural kind of handoff where we are balancing with a little bit more vocal fold engagement and a little bit less of the flow of air, and yet we still have to have that engagement. We still have to have the expansion and engagement here in order to allow the mechanism to be as released as possible. So evaluate your arpeggio practice, and you may even consider, in addition to that light and bright practice, trying a few vocalizations where you're allowing the vocal folds to separate a little bit and evaluate how you're using air, how you're releasing air over the vocal fold in that range of your voice. To that effect, it might sound something like where I'm allowing the vocal fold to separate ever so slightly to get a sense and a feel of how I'm engaging and how much air I'm expelling. I wouldn't recommend doing too much of that because we don't necessarily want to form that as a habit. We want to use it to evaluate our engagement and the flow of air, and then gauge that against what it feels like when we're singing with a fully adducted vocal fold. I do hope that helps. How long should I warm up my voice before giving an hour-long presentation? Any recommendations? Thank you very much. I love your videos. Greetings from Mexico City. Thank you so much for your question. Great question. If you are doing some performance practice on your presentation, and I hope you will, then you might, in that practice, start cold, do a 15-minute warm-up, and see how your voice performs throughout the hour-long duration of your performance practice. If you find that at the end of that hour period, you're getting really fatigued, or you're finding it tired, or something to that effect, then you may have to evaluate the length of your warm-up, in addition, what you're using to warm up with. without knowing a lot more of the specificities of your presentation, whether it involves singing or if it's only speaking. You've just said presentation, so you haven't said whether it's singing, speaking, or combination thereof. If, for example, you're a very dynamic speaker and you use a lot of higher stuff when you're talking and things like that, and you get very excited, then you want to make sure that before you begin your presentation, you have adequately warmed up so that your body can support that kind of phonation. And in that instance, it's not just that you do your 15 or 20-minute warm-up, but also that you warm up the tessitura that you know you're going to be using in the presentation. Now, I've said 15 minutes and I've said 15 to 20 minutes because that's a fairly typical amount of time to warm up for. That being said, everyone's a little bit different. The intricacies of your performance may require more or less. You're going to have to be the final judge on that, but those are a few thoughts to consider as you get ready for your presentation, and I hope it helps. I have never been able to do lip trills, even if I use my hands to help out. I feel like I'm missing out on a very useful exercise. Any tips to help resolve this or alternatives to lip trill exercises? So the lip trill is a semi-occluded phonation, which is to say that the lips form a partial barrier to the flow of air, and this takes a bit of the weight of the air column off of the vocal fold and allows it to change shape a little bit more easily. What it does is it shows us how we're using engagement or so-called support, or whether we're using it at all for that matter, and what it can feel like when the vocal fold has a bit more release. That's perhaps one of the more valuable aspects of the lip trill exercises. It shows us how the voice can operate when the vocal fold is more released. You can also use straw phonation, and there's a lot of different variants on that now, including like straw water, and you can get these really fancy straws that have different holes so you can alter the resistance. There's also, other things like putting the piece of tissue in front of your face. Like, that's not exactly the same thing because it's not providing any occlusion to the column of air, but it can show you visually if you are sighted, when the tissue is moving and how your air is flowing out of your body. That being said, the benefits of semi-occluded exercises, I think, are, in my opinion, a bit more helpful because of the effect they have on the vocal fold. You could also try rolling your R's, like rolling your tongue, but if you can't lip trill, I wonder if that's possible for you as well. The key to the lip trill, it often is in the consistency of the engagement from the core body muscles, and it's that absence that prevents us from getting the lips going effectively. So whether you're using your fingers to press in a little bit so that it takes a little bit of the weight of the lips off the teeth and making it a little bit easier, or if you're doing the super lip trill where you're pulling to make it a little bit harder, Either way, this has to remain consistently engaged in order for the lips to continue to flap in that way. Frequently, when I have clients that have difficulties with it, it is because they are focusing entirely on the lips and completely overlooking the engagement, or they're assuming that their engagement is good and looking at the lip trill and saying that there's a problem with the lips or something to that effect. Evaluate the consistency of your engagement and how you are moving air over the vocal folds, and that may get the lip trill going. Now, there's a lot of other ways to try to get the lips initially to burble. Sometimes people purse their lips too much. They're really kind of grimacing here. And if you've got a lot of muscle engagement, then the lips aren't going to flap. So you have to be able to let them be passive as much as possible. If you haven't, and this is kind of a shameless plug, but also there are legitimately some resources here. On my website, jeffrolka.com, there's a free method. You get the passcodes when you sign up for the newsletter. And I go through a much more detailed process of establishing the lip trill in those fundamental technique videos. You might want to consider checking that out and seeing if that helps you get it started and ultimately gets you to sustain it. It's an extremely useful exercise. It's not the end-all be-all of vocalizations, but it is really, really useful. And it's not just that freedom of muscle engagement around the vocal folds. It's also looking at air continuity through phrases and how you're phrasing, where you're phrasing, all sorts of stuff like that. It's a very useful exercise for learning new tunes so that you are coming at them from a released perspective with the vocal fold. A lot of good stuff in there. You can do a lot of it with straw phonation or straw water phonation. Those work really well too. That being said, if you can establish a lip trill, you don't need any straws and things like that, and it's very easy and readily available to you whenever you need it. So I hope this helps. Jeff, could you direct me to links of any lessons that involve straining your voice? I'm constantly concerned about it and how to identify it in the moment. Otherwise, anything you could comment on it would be great. Is it okay to push your voice and experiment till it reaches that point so you know when to stop? Thanks. I'll put those links in the description of this video. FYI, there's lots of ways to support my channel. You can find those in the description too. But yeah, I'll put that in the description. There's at least one video that comes to mind, and I've certainly talked about it a lot in different segments such as this. I know that now YouTube allows you to search segments or chapters, I should say, like chapter titles and things like that when these videos are done in chapters like this one. And so you might do a search of my channel and look for those too. But again, I'll put a couple links in the description. In terms of commenting, as a general rule, I recommend practicing your vocalizations with neutral tone production, which is to say that it remain consistent throughout the various registers of your voice or whatever stage of development you are currently in getting through the various registers of your voice. If the genre that you are singing requires more of some of that strained quality or something to that effect, then yeah, you can experiment with it, but I would caution you just to do it in small doses so that you are experimenting, evaluate the effects of said strain and whether you can sustain it, especially if you are planning to gig, and especially if you're planning to gig very frequently. You may consider that you will have to do that perhaps night after night after night. And if the strain is too much, or too frequent, or too excessive in a couple really quick goes, then it may not be sustainable for you to do that from night to night to night in your performance practices. So you have to evaluate a lot of different things when you go for some of the more extreme vocal stylings. That being said, if you use them with a certain degree of discretion, and you have good technique throughout the remainder of your set, and you're only using more strain or some extended techniques for specific instances, you can really do a lot to maintain the health and longevity of your voice and make sure that you can gig very, very regularly without having to take excessive amounts of time off or get into other problems like nodes and things like that. So I hope that helps. Do you have any exercises to help develop overtones, a rounder, richer tone on high notes near extreme of range in a classical opera style, not contemporary? So one, all the vocalizations on my channel are meant to be sung in what I think of as neutral phonation, which is to say that it is neither genre nor style nor kind of any of those things. They are all taken primarily from bel canto instructions. So the exercises, the vowels, the vowel sequences are all taken from classical technique, from opera technique. Now, depending on your genre, some adjustments to those vowels might be necessary. But in the vocalizations, the idea is to find the most natural mode of phonation for your voice and do the vocalizations in that capacity that would be consistent with your classical practice. You, however, mentioned extremes of range. And In truth, working on the registration events throughout your voice, making sure that you are making really good, effective crosses of those registration events, and working towards the greatest amount of freedom in the extremes of your range is the best way to have the richest, fullest tone in those vocal extremities. If you're trying consciously to place the pitch when you're in the extremes of your range, you will almost certainly be engaging muscles in the aural cavity that are not, strictly speaking, required to produce those pitches, and thus will be dampening down the resonant qualities of your voice. Any amount of dampening will rob you of the richness that you are after. So look for neutral vowel production. Look for really smooth, very consistent connections across the registration events, and all of these practices are here on the channel. Lastly, when you are practicing exercises that extend into the extremes of your range, do them quickly to begin with. One of the patterns in one of the extended range videos that I do is a 1-octave scale followed by an arpeggio. And in that video, I go very quickly. That is very much by design and by intent. If we try to go too sustained too soon, we risk losing our engagement while we're sustaining the pitch. And the moment that that begins to wane a little bit for us, the musculature here will pick up the slack and try to maintain the pitch. Again, that muscle engagement is going to rob you of your tone, richness, color, timbre, however you want to think about it. So those are places to begin. Fast exercises when you are moving into that range. And then finally, when you have repertoire that takes you into that range, I would create vocalizations out of the phrases in the song, begin with the vowels, and then work towards the lyrical content. Hi, Jeff. I sound like a soprano, mezzo, alto, tenor, and baritone. And I was wondering, when you play the Yamaha GB1K, which is my grand piano, how can I sing like a soprano, mezzo, alto, tenor, or baritone, like you say, where the sopranos, mezzos, altos, tenors, baritones begin with, and I'm going to interpret these from the IPA, E, A, A, O, U. I'm really sorry, but I really don't know what that question is. I want to help, but I'm afraid I don't understand. And I'd like to encourage you to elaborate either in the comments for this video or by your original question, and hopefully I can help. This next person broke up their question into 6 parts. I'm going to take them each in turn. When listening to music, I noticed that pronunciation above the secondo passagio is always incomprehensible. Is this just the nature of head voice, or can it be avoided? The more consistently we can maintain the flow of air in the upper register of our voices, the more consistent our tone quality and intonation will be. So it's a balancing act. Now, we can, of course, learn to maintain our engagement in those pauses, but it'll still be easier if we maintain the flow as much as possible. I suspect that the vocalists to whom you are listening are really slurring through those consonants to make the connection from vowel to vowel, and this is in fact something that we practice and teach when we're working on upper register performance. They can be incomprehensible, it's true. It can be avoided to a certain degree. You have to gauge it against the requirements of the range, how your voice performs in that range, and to a certain extent, the intelligibility of the genre that you are singing in. If you're singing musical theater, there is a higher degree of intelligibility, or a need to be understood, required. The story needs to be understood. If you're singing a Radiohead cover, you got a bit more leeway there. You can slur through those consonants quite a bit more, and it'll be totally fine. Certainly, your own artistic disposition should be thought of as well. You need to consider how much you wish to be understood. Gauge it against the effectiveness of your phonation and figure out a happy medium. What are the different styles of using the head voice? Apart from classical and pop, I know of only Swedish kulning tradition. And forgive me if I've said that incorrectly. Do you know of any other traditions? The first one that comes to mind is yodeling, which alternates between the chest voice phonation and head voice phonation, really usually in rapid succession to great effect. I'm not a great yodeler by any means, but you get this, you know, yodelay, yodelay, kind of a thing going on, and they'll go really, really rapidly through that sort of stuff. And it's really cool. I must admit, that's the only one I'm immediately familiar with. I wasn't familiar with the Swedish one that you've mentioned here, and I'm going to go check it out because I think that's really, really cool. Those of you out there may very well know of others that utilize those different kinds of colorations between the chest voice and a very, very heavily cricothyroid dominant head voice. I'd love to hear more about what you know, what you've heard, and what's out there. Is vocal fry damaging for your voice? How can it be done in the safest way? Can you use vocal fry higher in range on those notes which you normally sing in chest? Vocal fry is something that happens when there is a slight amount of separation of the vocal fold without too much vocal fold separation to get it to where it sounds like falsetto. In a comfortable range, like there, for example, high, 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 it is not particularly damaging. When you start to take it into the extremes, and more so I think on the high end, it is an imbalance of the usage of your voice. You are taking a little bit of the air away and using a little bit more of that vocal fold engagement, particularly when you're getting really, really high, to make that sound. So I don't think of it as being quite as bad as glottal attacks in the higher range of the voice. Those typically exert a lot of strain on the vocal fold. The vocal fry is a little bit of an imbalance. I would be careful in my usage of it. I would use it only on an as-needed basis for effect, if that's what you're thinking. You certainly can use it throughout the various areas of your voice, whether you're singing in chest or you're in your cricothyroid dominant singing voice, your head voice. You can do it to a certain extent. If you're going to begin experimenting with it, I would suggest you start lower down in your range and find out how it feels, find out how you can apply it consciously, and then play around with it a little bit more, always coming back to neutral phonation in between short instances of experimenting with it so that you continue to build upon good habits. I haven't mentioned it yet. Later on in the questions, the individual mentions that they're a beginner. And these are fairly advanced questions if you're very new to vocalizations, if you're new to singing in general. Vocal fry does come up in beginner studies to help them get the vocal folds adducted, get them closed. The thing of it is, though, is that we do need to move beyond it and get the vocal fold adducted without the benefits of that vocal fry so that we learn what more neutral phonation feels like. In other words, we have a good balance of airflow and vocal fold closure without one being too much or too little for that matter, because they generally work together in that regard. If you have too much air, then you generally have not quite enough vocal fold engagement. If you have too much vocal fold engagement, that's usually because you don't have enough air. I can reach the head voice notes, but I cannot sustain them. I just hit them for a very brief moment. What should I do in order to learn how to sustain them for longer periods of time? Again, I want to mention that the individual in their 6th comment, they say, "'cause I'm a beginner." So if you can sing in those cricothyroid dominant singing voice pitches, head voice notes, but they're short, that's probably good for right now if you are a beginner. Work on sustained lines in the comfortable area of your voice, below even the primo passagio, and then begin the process of working that into the zona de passagio, and then begin working on more sustained lines and sustained pitches above the secondo passagio, above the break. The secondo passagio and the break are synonymous. So that would be my suggestion to you. Take it slow, take it one step at a time. If you're in a hurry to sustain pitches above the break, above the secondo passagio, but you are still a beginner and you're new to vocalizations, by going too soon to that area of your voice, you're most likely to extend the time that it's going to take you to really be effective there. Work on sustain in comfortable areas. Learn what the additional engagement feels like as you make your way through the zona de passagio, ascending slowly into it. And by slowly into it, I mean exercises that only get higher and higher in small increments. So maybe you start, just going up to the fifth. And then next week, you take those exercises a semitone higher. So on and so forth. Not necessarily all in one day's exercises. I'm trying to make my low notes sound better without forcing them. I understand that the low notes should be sung gently, but I'd like to improve the timbre, make them more beautiful. What advice would you give me? I actually talked about this in the very first question. And I would say probably go back and listen to that if you skipped over it initially. I really talked a lot about low note formation. In brief, start bright, try a little bit of vocal separation to assess airflow, and then kind of wash, rinse, repeat, go from there. But again, more details if you click back to that very first comment. Finally, what it means if my vocal range varies from day to day. On some days, my low note, which is very quiet, is F3. On other days, it can be D sharp 3 or even D3. Does it mean that there's something wrong with my voice? There's some illness or damage, and I should stop singing, or is it normal? Sometimes I feel as if my low notes sound a little croaky, even if my middle register is completely fine. Is it just due to poor technique because I'm a beginner, or is there some other reason? What can I do to fix it? Basically, all of the above of what we've been discussing here in these really great questions. If you're new to vocalization, it's quite likely that things will change from day to day. Consistency comes with practice, and especially with observant, careful practice where you're working towards vowel alignment, appoggio breath management, and balance of the vocal fold. So on some days, you might be very balanced. On other days, you might not be. And hence, you're going to get some variety in the way that your voice performs for you throughout the various ranges. It's pretty normal to lose a major second on the bottom when you go from being cold, from not having sung, to warming up. But I don't get the impression that that's what you're talking about here. As a beginner, there could be all kinds of different things that you're doing that I can't gauge from your comment. And that's where maybe getting a lesson or a consultation with someone might really help you too. They might save you weeks and weeks of time in telling you what's happening, what you're doing, and what you can do to remedy the situation so that you can sing more consistently and get more consistent tone quality and response from your voice moving forward. I do hope all that helps. Great questions, and I wish you all the best, again, because you say that you're a beginner, and the beginnings of your vocal practice, your vocal journey. Enjoy exploring your voice. I have come across the term Inalare La Voce in my reading, but I'm not sure I can associate a sound with the concept. A high school friend was a trained operatic soprano, and she said she sent the notes out and then pulled back. And I wonder if that was Inalare La Voce. But I only came across the term some years later. Over the years, I've at one time or another thought of the tone as going out like a stream of water from a hose, or sort of staying in a plane at the front of my face, or traveling down into my chest, or rearward into my head, or sort of originating in front of my face and coming back into the front of my head. Not all at once, you understand. I've known some wonderful singers, and each of these sensations was espoused by one or more of them. Franco Corelli was right when he said there were so many ways to do it. However, wondering about Inalare La Voce today. Great to see community questions. So thank you very much. Great question. Inalare La Voce is not a term that I use very frequently in my teaching. For many of the same reasons that you articulate, specifically, I'm not sure I can associate a sound with the concept. I think that I could be diplomatic about Inalare La Voce, and I could be a little bit more cynical about it. If I'm diplomatic about it, then it's a concept about holding our position, holding our engagement, and a way of thinking about the usage of our bodies while we are in the process of singing. And yet it doesn't detail necessarily any of the specifics of the production of tone that are not in, for example, appagio breath management. In appagio breath management, we talk about suspension of the musculature, suspension of the air column. Appagio means to lean into it, and that's the predominant concept in that, and that we're leaning into the column of air. This allows the greatest amount of release around the vocal mechanism. And I think, again, that if I'm diplomatic, Inalare La Voce is another way of looking at appagio that at some point was extremely effective for a group of individuals, and they were able to grasp the concepts to effectively engage and suspend the air column such that they then turned and began to teach it that way too. That is also what the origins of a lot of the other modes of phonation that you described, such as going out like a stream of water from a hose, or having a plane at the front of the face, or traveling down to the chest or rearward into the head. These modes of teaching are, generally speaking, useful for a subset of vocalists, and they are perpetuated by the subset of vocalists for whom they work, and that's how they got started too. So at some point, someone said, think about the tone being back, coming out the rear crown of your head when they were working with someone on their upper register response. And it worked for that individual. And that individual went on then to teach that concept to their clients, and so on and so forth. It won't always work for everyone. And furthermore, depending on where we begin, it might not work for us. Hence why through the passage of time, we might at some time think of having the tone here out on a plane out in front of us. And then maybe we need to go back and think about it back here. And this is because those externalized concepts are done in order to help us adjust the way that the vocal fold is adducting and the balance of the flow of air over the vocal fold versus its engagement and adduction, closure. So if you are singing really far back, for example, you come into your lesson and you're bordering, I know that's ridiculous, but just for the sake of example, you're bordering on that, and then your instructor says, okay, cool, think about the tone coming out the front of your forehead. Okay, cool. But you know, the thing is that it all depends on where you begin. We started. If on the other hand, a different vocalist walked into the very same teacher and they said, the teacher would rightfully say, whoa, hold on a second here. Let's imagine this back, coming out the crown of the head. And then they turned around and sang, now we've got two different directions because of our different starting places, and we've landed in the same mode of phonation. It all depends on where you begin. It depends on if you're singing in English, where you learn to speak English. If you speak English with some variety of American accent, or you speak English with some variety of English accent, or something even beyond that still. All of these things have an impact on the instructions that we are given, and those instructions then get perpetuated. The problem is when we think that they are in fact objective fact. Place it forward, place it back. That's good singing. Not so much. It depends on where we begin. It depends on how we're using our voices. Inalare La Voce does incorporate a lot of arpeggio breath management practices. I generally don't refer to it because I find that when I look at the instructions for arpeggio, it breaks down more easily into easily understandable, practicable elements. Expand your rib cage. Maintain your engagement throughout both phonation and inhalation such that you get seamless turnarounds at phrases. Evaluate your tonal onsets. Do you have good coordination between the flow of air and the closure or reduction of the vocal fold? If so, you will get a nice neutral mode of phonation from your vocal folds. If not, practice short syllables in order to get better coordinated. That's why that one exercise that I like so much is so effective and I find so helpful because it alternates between those short, balancing, coordination challenging articulations and the melismatic scale. So when we get better at the short articulations, we can then hear our voices on that melismatic scale and get a flavor for that and then take it into our repertoire. Inalare La Voce makes this practice, I feel, more cerebral in sort of talking about the carriage and holding things open like that. But that language to me, I find somewhat more separated from the practical aspects that are generally taught in arpeggio. So it's quite likely that someone who is really, really down home with Inalare La Voce may find that those are off base. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Please tell me more about the practice. But in my looking into it, and particularly in looking at practitioners of it, they're very quick to talk about Inalare La Voce and the things that we're not to do. But that doesn't help us to know what we're supposed to do. If we only know what we're not going to do, we're still at a loss as to where to go from there. And the minute that we start to get instructions about where to go, it starts to sound a lot like arpeggio breath management. Now, if I want to take a bit more positive spin on Inalare La Voce, I would say that I like it as a finishing touch. That there's this idea of perpetuity in it that I feel is extremely helpful. The maintenance of that expansion, the maintenance of that engagement. Granted, I feel like a lot of that's already in arpeggio, that we don't necessarily have to go looking for yet another way of explaining it, but everyone learns differently. And some may look at that and it may resonate more with them and ultimately get them to give their best performance. So I hope that this helps. I think that, like many of the descriptors used in vocal pedagogy, because we cannot see the vocal fold, because we cannot grab it and touch it and manipulate it and do all of these things, we have to use metaphor and simile and visualization to affect change. It depends on where you begin, and it depends on where you'd like to go. If it works for you and you find neutral, sustainable, artistically pleasing vocalizations, then I would suggest to you that that is a great place from which to begin and to work with your repertoire and take it from there. Great question. Thank you for sharing that with us. And again, I'd love to hear from you and anyone else in the comments about this topic. Are there some tricks to hit high notes? What should I do if my voice feels tired and my throat hurts? Could you show us some exercises for better diction? Covering a lot of bases there. Tricks to high notes. I don't think of them as tricks, though I think that they frequently get thought of that way. The trick is, if you really make a good registration event, people will think you're stretching your chest voice all over the place. But what you've learned to do is voce piena in testa, the sound of chest voice in head. So, for example, an untrained vocalist across the break we'll get that falsetto-y tone production. An intermediate will get a very cricothyroid dominant, very head voicey kind of sound. And that may work for some artistically, and you can carry on like that. That's great. If you work towards balancing and releasing more, then that transition will still be there, but we can make the tones match. The transition's still there. I'm just doing a better job of balancing phonation across my secondo passagio, across my break. There's no trick, it's just practice. If your voice feels tired and your throat hurts, from the back to the front, if your throat hurts, stop, evaluate how you're singing, and if you really need to sing that way, or if there's some type of not really good engagement happening, your engagement, your support, in other words, isn't really serving your voice effectively, reevaluate and then start again. If you're feeling, and same thing with the tired, the fatigue usually comes before the pain. So if you're getting tired before you start to feel pain, that's just an indication that you're wearing your voice down over a longer period of time. So you're not doing one thing that's hurting it. It's just your general practice. Evaluate your breath management, evaluate your vowel alignment. Since you ask about tricks to sing high notes, if it's getting tired and fatigued because of a lot of high notes that you're singing, you might want to stick to the more neutral range until your technique develops enough to then sing those high notes without that fatigue and pain coming into the process. Could you show us some exercises for better diction? Ironically enough, usually the problem is the opposite, in that we are articulating, we are using too much enunciation, particularly upper register, for effective continuity of phrase and vowel alignment. So there's lots of like weird phrases and things like that. There's a whole like playlist. I'll put a link to the playlist in the description, because nothing really comes to my mind right now except for one exercise that I really like, which is kind of a articulator exercise as well as an engagement exercise. It was taught to me by a great friend and teacher, Megan Dibble. It goes like this. And you might do that, woo! You might do that a couple times in a row. I need to do that a bit more because I am feeling that. A great exercise for both engagement as well as using all of those articulators. But again, usually The problem is the other way around, that we need less of that articulation, particularly in the upper register of our voices. Sometimes, even after warm-up, I don't feel my full potential. I can dig it. Yeah, I have often felt that way. Sometimes it's an illusion. Sometimes it's the mind playing a trick on us. It's another way of performance anxiety creeping in. Sometimes we're really just not that warmed up. Sometimes if we've warmed up and we've been feeling kind of blah or tired or fatigued or something to that effect, we might need a little bit more to really get energized enough. Without knowing more of the intricacies of what you are dealing with, I would suggest that you do some body physical warm-ups prior to your vocal warm-ups. So if you can, do some jumping jacks, or maybe have a little bit of a jog up and down, like a little area of space, or run in place a little bit, or just do some arm things, especially cross body kinds of things that help with the brain talk across the corpus callosum, things like that, to really get you into your physical being before you then start to go into this both ephemeral and somatic experience of singing. Was this a live stream? I missed it. No, just a Q&A that I open from time to time, but thanks for chiming in. Thank you so much for your questions. I hope they help. I'm sorry I didn't warm up the lava lamp today. I just didn't turn it on quite early enough, but it's still here. Thank you all for joining me. I hope again that these have helped. My name's Jeff. Take really good care of your voices, enjoy singing, and hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.